Thanks, Hazel, and welcome everyone. My name's John Betch. I'm ecologist with the North Coast and Cascades Inventory Monitoring Network, and it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce and welcome Dr. Joshua Lawler to give our keynote address this afternoon. Dr. Lawler is the Orrin and Althea Sust Professor at the University of Washington in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. He also serves as the faculty director of the University of Washington Center for Urban Horticulture and Botanic Gardens. He received his AB from Bowdoin College and his master's and doctorate degrees in ecology from Utah State University. Dr. Lawler is a landscape ecologist and conservation biologist driven by applied conservation questions and their real-world applications. His interest areas include how anthropogenic factors affect species distributions, population dynamics, and community composition at regional and continental scales. Research involves investigating the effects of climate change on species distributions and populations, exploring the influence of landscape pattern on animal populations and communities, and climate change adaptation for natural and human systems. In addition, in his capacity as director of the UW Center for Nature and Health, some of his current work has been to investigate and illuminate the connections between time spent in nature with mental and physical health and well-being. I've recently also had the pleasure of working with Dr. Lawler for the past few years, evaluating patterns and trends in landscape disturbance ecology for some of our Northwest parks. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Lawler to give his keynote presentation.
Great. Thank you, John. And thank you, Hazel, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to talk today about climate change vulnerability, and in particular, climate change vulnerability across national parks. And then I'm going to shift gears about halfway through and start talking about two adaptation strategies that my lab group has been working on, things that we think might be particularly useful for addressing those vulnerabilities that I'm going to talk about. All right. So before I start, I want to acknowledge that the work I'm going to talk about has been a collaboration with several people. It's been several different projects, several different collaborations. Much of the work I'm going to talk about was led by Julia Mahalik, who was with my group, but is now with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Aji John at the University of Washington, John Gross and Gregor Sherman, who are both with the Park Service and are in for climate change team. Wendy Foden, who's with South African National Parks, and Guy Midgley, who's at Stellenbosch University. And then at the very end, I'm going to show you a couple maps that were put together by some students, graduate students in a class that I taught last winter. But you'll see that stuff later. They're listed at the bottom of the slide there. Okay, climate change. I'm not going to talk much about the general impacts of climate change because I think they're fairly well known at this point, but suffice it to say, climate change is leading to more fire, to more extreme weather events like droughts and floods. It's been linked to some extinctions. We're seeing changes in ecosystems and transitions in whole systems in response to climate change. And then sea level rise is also changing coastlines. And the pictures you're looking at, there's a picture of a forest fire, a picture of some sun-baked earth, golden toad. There's a picture of a savanna in southern Africa that's becoming treed due to increases in CO2 concentrations and climate change. And then there's a picture of water washing up over a beach and a road. So when we think about addressing climate change, one of the first recommended actions to take is to look at vulnerability, to determine how vulnerable one's resources or targets or things of interest are to climate change. In our case, that's going to be parks, national parks. And climate change is often described as having three main components, or being composed of three things. And that's exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. In this diagram, you see that sensitivity and exposure come together to make potential impact, and then that's modified by adaptation, adaptive capacity, and that affects vulnerability. Exposure, you can think of that as how much climate change something is going to witness, or and that doesn't have to be just temperature or precipitation. It could be changes in the fire regime or changes in sea level. And so how much are they exposed to? That's one thing. And sensitivity is for a given amount of exposure, a given amount of climate change, how much of an effect will it have? So you put those two things together and you get some kind of impact. Adaptive capacity has been defined as the ability of a system or the subject to be able to deal with climate change and to be able to adapt to climate change. And we're not necessarily talking about, in the broad sense, adaptive capacity could include evolutionary adaptation, but I won't be talking about evolutionary adaptation. We'll be talking about smaller timescales generally, but adaptive capacity modifies that impact. So, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, the climate team at National Park Service came to my group and said they were interested in determining whether parks in the US had had vulnerability assessments done for them, whether the national parks had vulnerability assessments done. And so we set out to review the literature to figure out how many parks have had vulnerability assessments, what had been reviewed, what had been assessed. And we dug into the literature and we found 87 vulnerability assessments. And 40 of those were true vulnerability, well, were explicit vulnerability assessments. They said this study is assessing the vulnerability of these parks to climate change. We found another 47 studies that weren't explicitly saying they were doing vulnerability assessments, but there was enough in them to indicate that they were assessing vulnerability that we included them. So we looked through those assessments and we found that the main thing that they were assessing, well, first of all, you're looking at a picture of a tree in Bryce National Park on the right, and then a chart on the left. On the vertical axis, we've got all these different targets that a vulnerability assessment might assess the vulnerability of. And then on the x-axis, you've got the number of assessments. And the bars are broken into two different colors. There's blue on the left, so the left part of the bar closest to the axis represents single target studies, and the gray multi-target studies. So the first thing you see is there's more gray on that chart than there is blue. And so more of these assessments targeted multiple targets or focused on multiple targets. The next thing you want to notice is that vegetation community, the vulnerability of vegetation communities was most often assessed. And then the least often assessed things were things like air quality and plant phenology. There were a couple types of assessments that were really specifically just that type of assessment. So sea level rise in particular, there were a number of assessments that were just sea level rise assessments for coastal parks, which makes sense. But that's what we were finding in these assessments in general. When we look across the parks, we found that all of the parks had an assessment of exposure. And this was due to the work of Patrick Gonzalez with the Park Service, who had taken downscaled climate data projections, downscaled climate projections, and summarized them by park to come up with an estimate of how much climate change each park might see. And so that provided this baseline across all the parks that we looked at. Beyond that, this is a measure of the percentage of parks that had assessments done for these different types of targets. And so 60% of the parks had, and I guess I should backtrack and say, these are all parks that had natural resources as a main component. And we worked with the Park Service to pick the folks we were working with the climate team to pick out these parks. And so it was 200 and maybe 60 parks, if I remember. So 60% of the parks had vegetation assessments done. And that was largely due to one particular study that looked at the vulnerability of tree species across the eastern US in parks to climate change. And then far fewer of the parks had any vulnerability for animals or for fire or for altered hydrology regimes or for pests and pathogens done. We look across the US and we look at the location of where these assessments have been done. This is a map of the US, and there are lots of dots. The smaller gray dots represent parks. If there's a little leaf, a little green leaf associated with the park, that means a vegetation or a plant vulnerability assessment was done. A little fire, a little fire indicates a fire assessment. A little bird indicates an animal. Bigger blue dot represents some sort of hydrological assessment. And then there's a little wave that represents sea level rise assessment. And you'll see a couple of things. One, you'll see the effect of that study on trees that covered most of the parks in the eastern half of the country. The second thing you might note is that comprehensive assessments that covered all of these or most of these different categories of targets were primarily in the West or in the Great Lakes region, and there were only 3 on the East Coast: Acadia National Park, Everglades, and there was one other one. The parks that had the most assessments done are labeled. So the parks with names on here, are the ones that had the most assessments done. So I had said 26 parks had those comprehensive assessments. That turns out to be about 9% of the parks had these comprehensive assessments. There were 37% of the parks that had no vulnerability assessment done other than that simple assessment of exposure that I mentioned. And then there were 10% of the parks, only 10% of the parks had a vulnerability assessment that was done specifically for that park. I mean, a lot of these were studies like the tree study I mentioned was like projecting shifts in tree ranges and then summarizing those across parks. So only 10% had a vulnerability assessment that was done specifically for that park. So the results of this led us to the next study we did with our collaborators, with our Park Service collaborators in Fort Collins, and that was to do a broad scale, sort of broad brush assessment of vulnerability for 259 parks, again, natural resource parks. And this wasn't going to help that statistic that only 10% of the parks had vulnerability assessments done specifically for them. Wasn't going to do anything about that, but we hoped it would start to fill in the gaps for some of the parks that had very little that had been assessed. We hoped that it would serve maybe to provide some information for the individual parks, but also for regional planning and for national planning to determine where to do focused vulnerability assessments. If we find that there are some parks that are more vulnerable than others, maybe that's where you want to go in and do a vulnerability assessment for that park. So you can think of this as sort of a screening or a broad brush assessment of vulnerability. And I'm going to walk through how we did that. Oh, there's pictures of 4 different national parks on the screen. So again, we were assessing vulnerability and we use these 3 components: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And there's a whole lot of stuff on the left-hand part of this slide. You don't have to pay too much attention to it. The main point is for each of these elements, for exposure, for example, we picked a set of individual indicators that were likely to indicate high or low exposure, some range of exposure. And there were a whole bunch of them, and a lot of them measured aspects of the same type of vulnerability. So we then boiled those individual indicators down to a set of what we called factors. And the list on the right side of the screen: temperature, precipitation, moisture, all the way down to early springs occurring. Those are all, and changing the fire regime, sea level rise, those are all the general categories. There are a few more than that, but I boiled it down a little more to fit on the slide. And so for each of these different individual indicators, we had a data layer. And we took the information for the data layer and we boiled that down to these factors. I'll explain how we did that in just a second. But we had a whole bunch of things for factors for exposure. And then we had a whole nother set for sensitivity and a smaller set still for adaptive capacity. And we scaled all these to between 0 and 1. We weighted them equally when we combined them into the factors. And then we again weighted those factors equally when we combined them into a single measure for exposure, adaptive capacity, and sensitivity. And then we mapped them out. So you're looking at a map of the United States with lighter colored beige dots all the way to darker colored red dots. The darker colored or the redder the dot, the more exposure. And these are just broken down into percentiles. So the red dots are the top 25% of the values. And you'll see in terms of exposure, we see the most exposure in the Southwest, and we see it through kind of the center of the country and a little bit to the Northeast. And a lot of this is being driven by temperature and in the Southwest, I believe, drought. So we see a pattern, and you're probably doing like I did when we first produced this, checking up and seeing what's going on in Washington. Washington moderately exposed, the parks in Washington. Sensitivity is a similar pattern in Washington, but a different pattern across the US. You see that sensitivity is not spread out in the same way, but there's higher sensitivity in California. Again, the darker the circle, the higher the level of sensitivity. And these are all relative measures, right? We're just looking at the top 25% of the values. And you may have noticed that there are weird shapes. These don't all look like circles, but when the parks are close together, the circles blend together and you get you get different shapes. So you see more sensitivity in the southeast, particularly in Florida, more sensitivity in California, and then little spots elsewhere. We take a look at adaptive capacity. We see that that's again, well, maybe a pattern that's it's a different pattern still, right? And we see more in the east, particularly along the east coast, the eastern, and then Florida and the Gulf Coast, and then again scattered adaptive capacities elsewhere. And these are all the lowest percentile of adaptive capacity, so the least adaptive capacity, leading to more vulnerability. So you're not going to be surprised that the next thing we did was to take these three things and combine them. And we did so in a fairly simple way. We used a simple formula that said vulnerability was exposure plus sensitivity minus adaptive capacity. And that produced the map you're looking at now. And this is just a binary depiction of that, where we're looking at the highest 25% of the most vulnerable parks and the rest. And so the red dots, or the darker colored dots, are where there's the highest vulnerability. And you can see the three elements kind of reflected in where these dots are located. But again, kind of center of the country, the Gulf Coast and Florida, and then a bit of the Northeast, and scattered other places. All right, so we did one more thing because we found that this was in some ways not all that satisfying. In some ways, because it was a relative measure, it wasn't satisfying. In other ways, we knew that there were individual factors that are causing vulnerability that are likely to have kind of a larger effect than others. They're likely to have greater implications. And so we took a look at some factors that might that we thought would potentially change parks. And so there's sort of changing whole systems in parks. And in particular, we looked at drought and pests and fire. We separately looked at sea level rise, where the sea level rise impacts are predictable. They're on the coast, not all the coast, but we looked at these three factors. And I apologize for the colors here. They're not only garish, but they might be difficult to see. But we looked at these factors, and we had more objective scores given the data layers we had that had risk of fire and risk of transition due to drought or level of pest. And so we could have levels that, if exceeded, we rated those as being highly vulnerable to these extremes. And so we then mapped which parks were most vulnerable to these particular threats. And you'll see that some individual threats appear, like the pests in the east, fire in the southeast. And then you're thinking, why isn't there more fire in the west? But if you look at anything that's orange or purple or brown or red has fire as one of its risks, you see that there's a lot of that in the western US. And so what we see in this map is that we see these combined multiple factors that may lead to transitions in the parks are generally to the west. And there are more single factors in the east. That's one of the patterns that we see. And fire, whether it's future fire or current fire, sort of dominated. We have those broken out. I just showed you everything at once, but future fire and current fire, dominated those events that we looked at, and then forest pests, and then drought, sea level rise, and storm surge, and storm surge. And sorry, you're looking at percentage of parks exposed to each of these events that are potentially likely to lead to transition. All right, so 67% of the parks had one of those high exposures, at least one of those high exposures that would potentially lead to transformations. And the pattern of where those high exposures are was fairly different than the pattern that we saw in vulnerability in general and high vulnerability. So those two analyses were telling us slightly different things, and potentially both important things. So now I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to talk about adaptation. And I'm going to talk about two adaptation strategies that my group has recently looked at. We've done a lot of work on connectivity and other things. I'm going to talk about these two. One I think is particularly, I think they're both promising. One is promising and concrete, and we've got good examples in Washington, and I'm going to walk you through that. And that has to do with climatic refugia. And the other example is a bit more aspirational and visionary and out there, and maybe was more realistic when we were thinking about it a couple of years ago, at least for the US, than it is now. But I'm going to talk through both of those. They're going to be very different things. But let's start with refugia. You're looking at a picture of a lot of little animals drawn on a hill, kind of crowding in to hide from climate change. And what climate change refugia are, I'll start with the definition of climate refugia. Climate change refugia are locations. There are many ways to define it. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to define these as locations likely to facilitate species persistence in a changing climate. So these are places that species can stay and populations can persist over time as the climate changes, or they're places where species might go to where the conditions will be suitable as the climate changes. And a lot of studies have attempted to map climate refugia because it seems like this is such a great thing to know where they are and to be able to manage them and protect them, because these might be really important places for biodiversity as climate changes. So there have been a lot of studies that have tried to come at this in different ways. This is some work that led a while back that mapped climate refugia based solely on projected changes in temperature. So the bright colored places on these maps, you're looking at the map on the left is North America, the map on the lower right is Washington with some of the surrounding, with BC and Oregon and some Idaho. And the bright colors are where species might be able to go that's not too far away, where climates will be similar to the places they are now. And so these are, you can think of these as these remaining bits of the climates that we have now will be in these places by the 2050s. She did projections for further out as well and using different climate models, and they look similar but smaller the further out you go. But this is one sort of broad brush of potential climatic refugia. You're now looking at a map of North America that has different colored blobs. The darker blobs that are blue on that map are where there are more places where there you might find more songbirds into the future. And this came from a study that Deanna Strahlberg did, and she used models to project how birds might shift their distributions over time, given climate change, and said these are the places where we see the least shift, where birds will remain, where these species will remain. And so, again, a broad brush view of where there might be refugia, particularly for birds in general, or songbirds in general. Others have created refugia for drought, so drought refugia, or fire refugia, or cold water refugia. And you're looking at a picture of a wetland in eastern Washington and a burn with some green trees still in it in places and a mountain stream. And so there have been these types of refugia. Other types of refugia have been identified and mapped. But what we found is there hasn't been much work at all done on refugia for individual species at a scale that would allow managers, for example, wildlife managers and a state agency, to manage for those refugia. The refugia I showed you before, these were really broad scale. These can be at finer scales, but they're just elements of what might be important to a particular species. So, with some funding from the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, we partnered with Washington, Oregon, and Idaho wildlife agencies and found a set of species that identified a set of species for which we could identify species-specific refugia. And we then held a series of workshops with experts from agencies, universities, NGOs, and tribes to identify what was important for these species in terms of habitat needs and their ecology, and then what climate impacts were they likely to see? How would they be impacted by climate change? And then we used all that information to develop refugia. So the 7 species, we ended up identifying 7 species to work on, and they included the salamander, the white-headed woodpecker, the fisher, the pygmy rabbit, sage grouse, coastal tailed frog, and the Rocky Mountain tailed frog. And in order to address those elements that were identified by those workshops with the species experts, we identified 42 different spatial data sets that we could use to address those elements that led to vulnerability or were important for habitat or were parts of, would help us understand climate impacts. And those include things like climate change projections, projected changes in fire regimes, hydrology, connectivity, stream temperature and flow, topography and soil, vegetation projections. And a lot of these data layers came from a guidebook that Jen Cartwright, who's one of our collaborators who is working on a related grant, published. And that's what you see on the right is the cover of that guidebook, which talks about all these data layers that have been developed for the Pacific Northwest that might be useful for dealing with climate change in one way or another. So we then took from that set of 42, we identified the layers that would be useful for each species, and we then put them together to create refugia. And for example, for the coastal tailed frog, it was projected stream temperatures and projected stream flow change and proportion of cool slopes or valleys and forest canopy cover. And the maps that are below the words here are of HUC's hydrological unit codes. You can think of them as imperfect watersheds. And for each of those watersheds, we summarized the different factors from each of these data sets. And then we combined, whoa, sorry, that's so fuzzy. But it doesn't really matter. You can just look at the colors or the shades. So we combined the first 2 of those. We combined stream temperature projections and stream flow to get an estimate of whether these watersheds, whether the streams, how much of the stream length in these watersheds would remain suitable. And so the darkest of red in here, the darkest color on this map is where there's most likely to be more stream that remains suitable through time. So that's the first 2 components. And here's another fuzzy map. The second 2 components, the percentage of forest and the proportion of cool topography, cool valleys, or cool slopes. We put those two together to get a measure of how much the topography and the forest cover might mitigate the stream temperature change or stream flow change. And so those are the darkest watersheds on this map. And then we set out to combine those. And we did that in a slightly complicated way that you can see here. This is a diagram of how we combined those two bivariate plots. And we basically took the highest refugia potential and combined it with the highest potential for mitigation and came out with four, or the highest two potentials for mitigation and came out with a set of 4 or 5 levels of potential for refugia. And then we mapped those across the landscape. And so on this map on the left, you'll see watersheds that are darker in color, and those are where there's the highest potential for refugia that had cold waters and slopes, the cool slopes, and more forest cover. And we used a very similar approach for all 4 of the cold water species. The variables differed. Well, the variables were pretty much the same. The thresholds differed. And obviously the locations differ because their distributions differ. We did this for the other species as well, and those, due to the groups of extras we brought together and how they thought we should be combining these factors, those processes were quite different in terms of how we put the variables together and combined them into single maps. We did try to avoid at all costs just one big index that combined all the numbers, because the group we were working with, the managers, wanted to be able to see and how they played out. So we did these 7 species, and then we thought, well, there's a lot more species that Oregon, Washington, and Idaho wildlife agencies would like to see. And so in talking to Washington Fish and Wildlife, they said, well, we know it's going to be impossible for you to do that for hundreds of species because it took long enough to do it for 7. So we tried to come up with other ways to determine where there might be refugia. And the first thought was to look at whole systems and say, okay, for wet forests or for forests in Washington, where might refugia be? Or for streams and other aquatic systems, where might refugia be? And for the sagebrush steppe, where might refugia be? And we could do that. Like, we could come up with some of the things that we thought were important in each of those systems for determining which places would remain more like they are now. But we found that not to be totally satisfying, because we knew that individual species in this system, these would have different sensitivities and different adaptive capacities, and the refugia were going to be different for these different species. So we weren't totally satisfied with this. And what you're looking at is there's pictures of those 3 different systems I mentioned above, and then there are some maps with some bright blue or lightly colored polygons on them that represent watersheds that met criteria to be refugia for these different systems. Some set of criteria we came up with, right? But we weren't satisfied with that. So what we decided might be useful instead would be to let groups of experts come up with their own refugia, set their own thresholds, determine what data layers were most important, and to put them together themselves. Take us out of the picture and keep us from slowing the whole process down. And so we developed a prototype tool to do that. And in this prototype, you could pick a system, and that would give you a set of different variables. And then you could move these sliders to set thresholds for these variables and highlight a set of watersheds that met those criteria and might serve as refugia. And we currently have and this was as far as we got, but we currently have a grant that's going to allow us to work with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to try to see if this would be useful and to see what we could do to make it more useful. Ideally, we'd allow one to pick from 100 different data layers for different variables and then move sliders. But we don't even know if that would be particularly useful. And so we want to work with them to figure out if there's something we could build along these lines that would be useful in the planning process or to plan management activities. All right. So, slight shift of gears again to talk about a different adaptation strategy. And this is the one that I said was a little more aspirational, a little more theoretical, and a little less concrete. And this is an idea that actually pulls together several concepts that have existed for a while and puts them together in landscapes. So one of the big suggestions for how to deal with climate change for biodiversity is to have more protected areas, bigger protected areas, to have better connected protected areas. You've probably heard of the 30 by 30 goal from the Convention on Biological Diversity's 2030 goals. Target 3 is to have 30% of the planet protected by 2030. A number of other groups have picked up on those. And then there have been more calls for half the Earth to be protected, and other calls everywhere in between. Um, and while those may help address climate change, there are several reasons why. One, we may not be able to do that. At least we won't be able to do that in the way it's been done in the past. And uh, and it may not be enough. It may not allow the Earth to all the species on the Earth to move around and adjust and deal with climate change. So, specifically, some of the challenges that are going to make it hard for a protected area paradigm that we've used for much of the past in many countries is the fact that species are going to move around a lot, that there's going to be a reduction in ecosystem services that people see, and that the past system has created some environmental injustices that get perpetuated through time. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn. So you're looking at a map on the right that comes from a recent paper that came out last year that did a review and summarized information on species range shift, how species have moved in the past. And it's not a typo. I didn't misspell my name. This is not one of my papers. This is from somebody else. But what this paper found, and what a lot of other papers have found, is that species are moving. A lot of them are moving. Many of them are moving in the direction we'd expect given climate change, and that other studies have shown that we're likely to see many, many more species moving. So that in the future, there are going to be thousands of species that need to move across continents to move to suitable climates. Many species won't need to move, but many species will need to. And the corridors that work from my lab has done, that is planned for, other groups have planned for, these little connective corridors of highly protected strings of land may not cut it in terms of allowing species to move as much as they need to move. You've probably seen projections of crop losses and losses of water availability and people migrating because of increasing temperatures or sea level rise. So there are going to be lots of impact on humans. And we'll still need to produce the amount of food and fiber for the people on the planet, and people will need a place to live. Washington may still see a demand for housing and people coming in from other states that are warmer than our state. And so there's still going to be demands that people are going to put on the landscape, making things difficult as well. And finally, in the past, in many countries, when protected areas were set up, people were displaced. And the picture on the left is Kruger National Park, and the picture on the right is of Yellowstone National Park. In Kruger, people were removed as the park was being developed. In Yellowstone, I believe all that happened before the establishment of the park, but people were still removed in the place that is now the park, of course. So a conservation landscape mosaic, we're defining those as large interconnected landscapes and seascapes composed of areas with different levels of protection and different types of management that cover most of the Earth. Not 30 or 50%, but you can imagine these things potentially covering most of the planet. And so it's the idea that and this is not a new idea in particular, it's the idea that we go from a binary, what's more or less a binary landscape of protected and unprotected lands to a mosaic that has lands with different levels of protection. And the objectives of this would be, one, to facilitate species range shifts through the matrix through everywhere around the highly protected areas to address growing human needs in the face of climate change and to prevent further climate injustices and environmental injustices. So what does this entail? You're looking at a fairly complex diagram where there are some horizontal boxes on the left that have 4 different levels of protection. The darkest of them on the top is a high level of protection that has minimal human activity, detrimental human activity, and the bottom would be a low level of protection that allows most activities to occur. And you may be thinking, yeah, our landscapes already have that. Like our landscapes have wilderness areas and national parks, which have really high levels of protection. And then there are Forest Service lands and BLM lands. And then there are private lands, most of which are unprotected. One of the differences, those lands generally aren't coordinated. And the lowest level of protection, the private lands, is generally most of the private lands are not, have very little, if any, protection. Although there are regulations for sure. All the vertical boxes on the right of this show the different conservation targets that might be served by these different levels of protection. So the highest level could be where biodiversity hotspots and threatened species and ecosystems are protected. Climate refugia might be protected across a wider range. And then the restoration of indigenous rights all the way over to regulating and supporting ecosystem services be things that could be encouraged across these entire landscapes. And then some things like biodiversity-friendly agriculture and urban green spaces could be important in some of those areas that have the least protection. So how's it going to do those 3 things, those 3 objectives? Well, facilitating species movements and providing for human needs, that could be done in these landscapes that have lower levels of protection by changing the way we do things. And these are all things that exist and are familiar to many of you, right? In forests, that could be retention harvests and mixed multi-age stands and gap creation. And in agricultural landscapes, they could be smaller fields with some crop diversification and some more landscape left in a natural state. And this wouldn't have to happen everywhere, but this type of alteration of how we do things could happen in particular areas that were the most important for creating permeability and movement of species. And we have all the models that project where those places might be. In terms of preventing climate and other environmental injustices, these landscapes, other than not removing people from the land anymore, these landscapes won't do that on their own, but it would take increased amount of indigenous leadership and inclusive planning and management and governance and community-led conservation. And there are some examples of how that might happen. There was in the recent past, the Nature Conservancy and the Conservation Northwest worked with the Colville tribes to return 9,243 acres of land to the Okanagan people. And that land was in part targeted because it was important for connectivity, important for movement and permeability in that region. And some other examples of pieces or examples of this type of thing are the biosphere reserves, which have a core highly protected area and then areas around them that allow more and more human uses, but it's a coordinated, managed landscape. Another tool that exists are other effective area-based conservation measures, which are called out, and the Convention on Biological Diversity targets as well as being a way to protect land. And these are protected areas that are don't have biodiversity necessarily as the goal, but they do, and they allow other uses, but they do protect biodiversity. They have targets they need to meet. And finally, an example from our neck of the woods is the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. And this is not an area that's primary goal is biodiversity, it's scenic beauty, but it's an area that is managed by a commission from 2 states and multiple counties. The commission consults tribal leadership, the Forest Service, who manages the most highly protected portions of it, consults with the tribes as well. And so this is an example of maybe that kind of landscape. All right. And the last thing I'm going to show you is some work I did with a graduate class last year to take this concept and try to at least begin to map it out on the landscape. And so what you're looking at here is just a decision matrix of how you might determine what level of protection. We're not breaking the landscape into particular mosaics, but how you might assign levels of protection based on the need to do all of these different things. And there are much more complex ways to do this with optimization and other approaches, but this is just to give you an idea of what this might look like. So this is a map of Washington. And the brightest colored places are places that are already protected or are federally recognized tribal lands. The gray areas, if you can see the next lightest color, is probably the urban areas. And then the next brightest yellow, those are the lowest protection, and all the way up to the green, that's the highest protection. And this is just one way that one might map out these potential levels of protection. You can see some areas that were particularly in there for connectivity reasons in eastern Washington. This is a map that's another way, and if you flip back between them, you can see there's different amounts of the lowest level of protection. Depends on what is prioritized first. Just some examples of what this might look like. All right, so I'm going to wrap up. And in wrapping up this last, the idea of these conservation mosaics, it may seem rather far-fetched and rather extreme to be considering. But when you take into account what we will really have to do to address climate change, the fact that we may need to change economic systems, we may need to change governance systems, change the way we produce food, it may not be so far-fetched to imagine a future where we have a different relationship to the land and we treat the landscape as these complex social ecological systems and have a different ethic and could support something like that. All right. And I'll stop talking now. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. That was a great talk, and I appreciate all the thought you put into this with your collaborators over the years. The refugia and connectivity of these, you're getting a lot of accolades and applause I'm seeing here. Um, Yeah, so great work with the tool. There are just a couple questions in the Q&A, and I'm gonna invite people to add another question or two if they have them in mind for Josh. I'll ask the first one from Mark Mobbs. Was a similar analysis. I think it was timed around when you were showing the frog analysis. So it was a similar analysis completed for aquatic resources, clearly cold water species, including salmonid fishes, and at least some of the Pacific Northwest aquatic species, such as coastal tailed frog, and others could be facing major risks from climate change. So if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Mark. Like we did look at two other semi-aquatic species, but the when I said that there were very few assessments done for specific species, the place where that's not true, the most not true, is with salmonids and cold water refugia. A lot of work has been done on cold water refugia and refugia for specific cold water fish. So that is something we didn't do, but that's work that a lot of groups around the Pacific Northwest have done. I have colleagues that have used different types of data to find the coldest spots in rivers for particular cold water fish. Yeah, so that's a good question.
We have a second question from Noah Link. Did any of the vulnerability assessments you reviewed evaluate the vulnerability of public access or cultural resources?
Yeah, good. That's a good question too. So when that climate group at Park Service brought us together, we were focused on the natural resources, but there were other groups focused on cultural resources and on, I think maybe like structure and infrastructure. And there was a whole group looking at cultural resources, access to cultural resources, and the condition and the vulnerability of those resources themselves. Um, and plenty of parks were vulnerable, and plenty of more assessments needed to be done. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have a third and last question from Teodora Minkova. Is the concept of conservation landscape mosaics different from the land sharing and not land sharing, land sparing concept? The
Yeah, no,
latter was Yeah, the latter was developed for balancing conservation and production, not specifically for climate change.
Yeah. No, that's a great observation. And I was thinking I'd get that question. Um, in a way, it's just more sharing. Like it's more land sharing. But it's also kind of a combination of both because there is some land sparing in there, and there's lots of land sharing to different degrees. So it's kind of taking those concepts, putting them together, and applying them across the whole landscape. But that's a good parallel. I mean, you picked up on that parallel for sure.
Okay. And so one last question, a thought for you on a personal level. It's a pretty weighty topic that you're working with here in terms of a research topic with all the various problems that it's a lot going on and a lot of different things to consider. Do you have any personal comment on what motivates you to keep going?
Yeah. Um, I think what motivates me is my love for the natural world. And I mean, I love the places, the places we have in the Pacific Northwest and around the world that are natural and the species that are there. So, I mean that's the reason I do the work I do. I actually was more interested in being an environmentalist than a scientist and kind of stumbled into being a scientist. Thought it would probably support a career better than some of the things that were happening when I was a teenager, and being an environmentalist might have gotten me in more trouble than a scientist. So
I think I can relate to that, Josh. So thank you very much, and we really appreciate that. And with that, I think Hazel will usher us on into the next endeavor. Thanks very much, Josh, for your talk.
thanks, John. Thanks, everybody.